friends, how are you doing today? My name is Mary and this is Happily Ever Esch, and today I am sharing with you my nonfiction November wrap. I had so much fun with nonfiction November. I read really great books. There were a lot more books that I wanted to get to, but you know, they will be there for the later months. But it was so much fun just to see what everyone was picking up and just all the nonfiction love. It was just really cool. I love that we are celebrating this and we take a month to do it. So let's just hop on into what I read. So the first book I finished on audio was Another Day in the Death of America, a chronicle of 10 short lives, and this is by Younge. I figured out it's Young, even though there's an E at the end. But this was just as wonderful as everyone says it is. This is Younge, who has picked out one day in America and examines all of the gun deaths of people under the age of 19. And like Gary says, those are all the reported deaths. A lot of times accidental shootings or just shootings in general aren't reported in the news, especially for young children. But he wrote this very closely to the time that the Sandy Hook tragedies have happened, and there was a tracking system that was doing a pretty good job of tracking the gun death in America at the time. I think it was through the New York Times or some news outlet, I can't exactly remember. But anyway, this looks at, like it says, 10 short lives, and each chapter is one of the children who have lost their life. Gary does a great job of telling the story of the families as best he's able to. He's kind of relying on all of his own research into social media and interviews with the family if he's able to do that. But he does a great job of weaving those stories in with just facts and statistics and policy and his own opinions, and he does it very seamlessly. You don't feel like you're getting too much of the story and not enough outside information, or the other way around. He kind of just balances it perfectly, and I think pieces of nonfiction like this are important because it gets us reading, it gets us talking. He explores a lot into who these deaths are affecting most, and obviously that's impoverished areas and minority groups, in particular Black Americans. Like, gun violence is disproportionately affecting and hurting those communities. And he really kind of digs out like what's going on here. I think kind of America as a whole is just very desensitized to gun violence, but that doesn't escape these very impoverished communities who are experiencing the trauma of gun violence every day and who are very desensitized. And you know, he talks about how a lot of lives in these areas are just, it's very common for families to prepare themselves for the possibility of their children dying of gun violence, and how tragic and sad that is. And I really think it's telling that the policy in America reflects that, reflects who we're willing to protect and who we're not going to. And it just, I think if you read this book without getting angry, I guess you can, but I would be very shocked. This book made me very angry and sad for the state that our policy in America is in. I also thought he talks a lot about how media like blames parents. Like, there's a lot of parent shaming and blaming. I don't know, I'm probably not doing this book any justice, but it made me really think. It made me think about new things that I hadn't. And yeah, I didn't go in disagreeing that policy needs to change, but this definitely gave me a broader idea of like how gun violence is affecting communities, and in particular our youth. So it was really good, guys. I highly recommend that you read this, and the audiobook was great, so you should read this book. So this is a quote in the book that I found particularly powerful, and it is Gary's response to one of the mothers who has lost her son, but she lives in the suburbs in Ohio, and she's saying like, this doesn't happen here, I'm not living in the hood. That's what she's saying, and then this is Gary's kind of written response to that. This is less the product of malign neglect than an unconscious omission born from the deadweight of power and privilege that makes the poor and dark in America invisible. In short, there are places in almost every American city where children and teens are expected to get shot. Areas where the deaths of young people by gunfire do not contradict a city's general understanding of how the world should work, but rather conform to it. To raise children there, whether they are involved in crime activity or not, is to incorporate those odds into your daily life. And so yeah, that just describes some of the great writing in this book and just also some of the powerful words Gary writes about. But in keeping with that, the next book that I listened to audio was Evicted by Matthew Desmond. And this subtitle is Poverty and Profit in the American City. And this is all about what it says on the tin. Eviction, the issues with it in America, how it's negatively affecting the poor and keeping the poor poor. And that quote where he's talking about there's places that we just don't care about and that you're just expected to live in the violence is really driven home here when we're looking at places that are impoverished and we're looking at how the poor is kept poor through extremely high housing rates and through being herded into specific areas of cities. And so these two books read together were so great, and I am so glad that I did. But anyway, Evicted is Matthew Desmond, kind of just his masterpiece. He spends time painstakingly researching this. This book is set in Milwaukee, and he is just doing some pretty intense casework with a bunch of different families in Milwaukee. He is in all of the more impoverished parts of Milwaukee. There's a lot of segregation of the wealthy and the poor, and then the poor also being segregated a lot by race. But he gets in there and lives life with a couple of the people in this book, as well as with a landlord who owns a lot of property in these impoverished areas. And like I said before, he just really researches the judicial process of eviction, kind of tenants' rights, landlord rights, and then he really delves into some lives and their situations, why they're in the situations that they're in, and just kind of follows them as they live the years and trying to find housing. And yeah, it was just very powerful. He has a very wide scope of individuals from many different backgrounds. He is, in particular, he's looking at one trailer park where he follows quite a few different individuals, and then following this landlord who owns lots of properties. He follows some families who live in her properties, and then follows the landlord quite a bit as she's doing the evictions, doing the rent collections, going to court to evict people, just all of the things. And then at the end, he also created this huge study to kind of see if the data that he was collecting in the field was comparable with the data in general. And he basically is like, there's a problem with data collection based on eviction and housing and all of that. And he basically had to make his own surveys and conduct his complete own few studies to gather the information that he needed. This one, Michael Desmond, the Pulitzer Prize in nonfiction, and for good reason. It's just so good, so unique, and he really shows how constant eviction, constant moving is such a huge issue and such a huge ignored issue in poverty. He looks into policy and how there's essentially little to no funding and programming for people in housing in general. He's really looking at the cycle why children in poverty usually have such a hard time in school, and why it's so hard for a lot of people in poverty to keep a steady job, and why it's so tough to get enrolled in services, and why people in poverty are oftentimes people who are involved with children's division and have their children in care, and just all of these things. And a lot of it can be linked back to just this total uncertainty of home and where is home and will you have a home, and it's amazing that this has been so ignored for so long as a huge issue. And the way he points that cycle out, like he really shows you. He shows you through these stories and then has the data to back it up and prove it. And it really is an epidemic. It's an epidemic how many people are being evicted every day and have no housing security, and then also how horribly gouged they are being by the housing system in America. Points out that most housing in really impoverished and low income areas is really not that much cheaper than an apartment in a nicer area of town, or an area of town that has better schooling or more parks or libraries. The prices are pretty comparable. As he says, like a 2-bedroom apartment is a 2-bedroom apartment. It doesn't really matter where you are a lot of times, and obviously that's not always true. There are, you know, different prices, but for the most part, a lot of the pricing is pretty comparable in areas that would be, you know, more family friendly and areas that would be safer places to raise your kids and all of the above. But that the process is so heavily vetted. If you have an eviction on your record, if you have any sort of crime history, you know, any sort of debt, like you're totally written out of the race. And so you're stuck in really horrible situations with really expensive rent that you can't afford. And that's a huge issue. It's a huge issue. And so yeah, I just read this book, guys. It will open your eyes. It will make you very mad. And it will make you wonder, like, why you haven't thought about how integral, like, housing inconsistency and housing just issues are. And I think maybe, like, if you're like me and live, you know, have lived middle class or upper middle class or upper class your whole life, will not have even thought of this as an issue. Like, I've always had a home. My parents own their own home. I've rented apartments since I started college, and, you know, it's never been an option for me that I wouldn't have a home. And I remember when my husband and I were looking for apartments, you know, I didn't have a fear that I wasn't going to find one, but I just remember the anxiety of, like, we have to find a place and we have to, you know, pay the deposit and X, Y, and Z, and we had been saving and, you know, making sure that we had money to do that. And, like, that's such a privilege, you know, and, like, not even considering that. So I think this book is important. I think I'm going to buy myself a copy because, like I said, I took it out from the library and listened to it on audio, but it's so good. Both of these books. Both of these books. Read them. It'll be great. And then last but not least, sorry, that was a big rant about those two, but I feel very strongly about both of them and how wonderful they are. Anyway, the next and last book I finished for Nonfiction November was A Walk in the Woods by Bill Bryson. And I've never read Bill Bryson before, but I'm sure many of you have. He's a very famous kind of travel, life, memoir writer. I know he's written a lot of books about his time in England, and he lived in England for 20 years, and this is his first book after moving back to America, and he decides to walk the Appalachian Trail. And this is just kind of his study of the Appalachian Trail, his experience with it, his experience with returning to America. It's got a lot of environmental issues in it, but it's a lot of fun. I was laughing out loud a lot of times while reading this, but there's also a lot of really poignant points about it. Yeah, and I think if you like kind of Americana type books that just kind of explore America and just the different quirks to it, but also takes a pretty hard look at what we're doing to kind of destroy our beautiful earth at times, that you would really enjoy this one. I partially listened to it on audiobook, but mostly read it. I probably listened to an hour or so of it on audio. But yeah, I loved this. It was written in 1998, so some of the environmental talk is outdated, obviously, and some of his like talk of the park systems and their funding and policy is outdated, but like the heart of it I think is still very poignant and relevant. So yeah, Bill Bryson's hilarious. And I have, what do I have on my shelf? Oh, Notes from a Small Island. And so I'm excited to pick that one up as well. So yeah, I loved it. And he really does like manage to pack so many topics into such a little book. And then I didn't finish, and I'm not going to anytime soon, but potentially will eventually, is Upstream by Mary Oliver. It's due back to the library and it has hold, so I need to take it back. But I read like almost half of it, and I really enjoyed this. It's just kind of beautiful thoughts and sentiments by Oliver, who was a poet, and you can very clearly tell by her writing she loves creating, and she loves people who have created literature, and she also loves nature, and that's kind of just what this essay collection is looking at. Definitely not something you want to speed through. I've in November read this much basically over the whole month, just really taking my time with it. And I think it's one that I want to buy and have on my shelf and mark up. It's very raw and beautiful, and I just think needs to be taken slow. So yeah, I will be coming back to this, but will not be finishing it for Nonfiction November 2017. So that was what I read. I had a great nonfiction November. I hope that you did too. I hope that this video wasn't too rambly for you, but I read some great books, guys. But what did you read? What did you enjoy? Have you read any of these books and loved them as much as I did? Or maybe you didn't like them so much? I'd love to chat with you about it in the comments. But yeah, what did you read? Tell me all about it. I hope that you guys are having a great December, and I hope to talk to y'all very, very soon. Bye.